today's session is about when, what, and why would you use technology in education. And I think the biggest misunderstanding of people in education, whether it's university education or K-12 education, is that you need to do a lot of technology. That's not necessarily true, because technology doesn't teach children, teachers teach children. Anyway, I just lost the slide, the image there. Mustafa, can you go back to the slide and go to slide number 2?
Okay.
Perfect. So we're going to look at a couple examples to simply discuss what kinds of technology is sort of at the cutting edge of most classrooms in the world. And some of these stories and some of the examples that I'm going to give today are ones that are relevant wherever you are in the world. In our MOOCs, we've certainly run across people in India, in the Caribbean, in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, about how they're using technology in a worth it way. And what I mean by worth it is it worth the time to do it for the teacher? Is it worth the cost? Because everything that we do in a classroom has some cost. And is it in line with the curriculum? So if we're teaching how to bake cookies, does it help to use technology to learn how to bake cookies? If we're teaching how is it to speak in another language, does it help to use technology for that? Next slide. So the 2 examples we're going to start with, just simply because I think smartphones or tablets are very common around the world, regardless of what educational situation. They're common access, not necessarily always an iPad, not necessarily always a smartphone, but these kinds of technologies, tablets, laptops, are pretty accessible as technology for education. So we'll look at these 2 examples, and then we'll also look at one more, which is social media. So we'll take a look at these for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then and go through some examples at the end and try to figure out if we can decide if it's worth it. Next slide. So when we take a look at some technologies, one of the, I think, longer traditions of using technology has to do with storytelling. Part of that is because one of the most common uses for technologies is to record or write something on a device. Meaning the most early uses of digital technologies were to write or type out text. And if you think about it, email is an example. When you send an email to somebody, you're actually using a digital platform, your email platform, to write out text to send somebody. It might not be a story, it might be a short message, but the concept is the same regardless how short it is. So digital storytelling is one of these things we can look at. Next slide. So in a class where a teacher says, well, we'd like to have students create a story for whatever purpose, maybe it's an art class, maybe it's a language class, maybe it's an English class, or what we call language arts in North America, where the teaching of how English works and how to write. So in these kind of situations, digital storytelling, what can you do on the iPad that you cannot do on a piece of paper? Well, you can draw digitally. And here's an example, next slide, of a picture for digital digital art. Next slide, please. When we look at what kinds of technologies, today we don't actually need anything more than an iPad or than a digital screen of some sort, either a mouse or to touch with a finger or a stylus. And in fact, people can draw. Next slide. So when you take a look at Sorry, I'd have to interrupt. Somebody's mic is not on mute, so it's pretty loud for everybody. Can you check that your mic is on mute? Somebody on an iPhone, it says iPhone. That person is not on mute. If you could just go click on mute. I know it might be tricky on an iPhone. Thank you. That solved that. And as people join us here today, that's just fine. They can jump in as long as we go. So taking a look at that, back to this iPads for storytelling or a tablet, is it worth the time? Well, what did we gain by having digital creation instead of paper and pencil? Is it worth the cost? Because there's the cost of the iPad, the cost of electricity, the cost of the apps. And is it in line with curricular goals? Is the intention to make a story that needs to be shared? That's how we might consider using an iPad or not for storytelling. Because of course, if you make a story on a piece of paper with a pencil and crayons, one of the things different about a digital version is that I can change things, modify them, save them for the next day, add to them, record audio, which I cannot do on a piece of paper. So if there's an interest to have media, where students could be creating media, then it might be beneficial to have used an iPad or technology of other kinds to create a digital story. Next slide. So that was an example in grade school. Let's take a look at an example in university. The same kinds of things might apply in a university setting. In the picture you're seeing is a graduate course in business marketing. Next slide. So some of the advantages of using iPads in university settings mean that it has affordances that paper and pencil or scissors and magazines have to be able to do activities in the classroom. So some of these advantages are that we can have immediate access to information. It's mobile. Students can engage with it. And importantly, it's shareable. So the one advantage of this is I can display that on a large screen. I can even display it like I am now for you around the world, whereas a piece of paper is not that easy to do that. It's flexible, meaning I can use it for multiple things. I can take it to my desk and work around it with a group of students, but also, most importantly, it is editable, revisable. So students can work on it one day, they can come back to it next day, they can come back to it a month from now. And many university courses have projects and activities that go over time, meaning through the use of through a course. Many activities include projects. And so these are the kinds of things we would have an advantage, perhaps, of using technology, again, as compared to a piece of paper, because that's the technology we were using before. What kind, no, go ahead, slide, change, please. So in this case, the researcher that I had worked with was using very simple, free apps, and she was using the drawing pads for the students, the master's students could draw images together. They then used a book creator or creative book building apps to put together several pages that they created over 4 months. And then at any given time, she asked for them to share it with the classroom by going up to the front and projecting it that way. So that's a lot easier than holding up a piece of paper, and a lot more professional. So very much similar to what the students would be doing if they worked for a marketing company after university. Next slide. So is an iPad, again, we could substitute the word laptop or any other digital device that allows us to do these things. Is it worth the time? It does take time for the professor to organize iPads, to make sure that students have logins, to be able to access the internet in whatever situation they are. And it does have a cost. If students don't have iPads, well, the university might need to bring a set of 5 or 10 iPads to a classroom. There is a cost, again, to electricity. There's a cost to the technical support for the classroom. But if it's in line with the curricular goals, this might make it worth it. This kind of activity is exactly what students, or what a professional in a marketing company does. They actually do create mock-up marketing strategies and then have to share them with their colleagues and their executive or their managers, and develop that and then share it with their clients. So it really does do the same kind of process. So in this case, it might be very much worth it, because that is the tools, or are some of the tools that they do use in the real world after in a workplace situation. So next slide. Another large sort of group of technologies is around social media. And if we, again, next slide. If you take a look at what social media is, basically social media is simply Web 2.0. Many people don't even make the distinction anymore, simply because a lot of X generation, a lot of students these days only grew up in the time of when the read-write web existed. So social media is simply all technologies online in a sense. But for those of us that were around when there was no internet, or when the first generation of the internet was there, where you could click on a website and look at it, this idea of being able to look at a website and then quickly post to it, or simply post to it, is really what we're talking about when you talk social media. There's a couple other sort of elements of social media. Next slide. And when we think about social media these days, or when we talk about it, really we're talking about any of these. We could be sharing music, could be sharing GPS, meaning map apps to travel and find out where you're traveling. Reputation, meaning, for example, if you look on my Google citations, you'll find lots of information about my reputation in the academic world and what I've written. If you go to social networks like Facebook, like Weibo in China, like those kinds of networks allow us to share across large networks. Like the telcop.net website is actually a social network for teachers that are interested in learning about technologies. And again, you know, many of these kinds of social media types simply are duplicating and extending what we do from our one computer at home or on our smartphone that we're carrying with us to the entire world. Again, another example is exactly what we're doing. This presentation is a kind of social media. You all can, just like I can, contribute to the chat. And so we're all communicating in a social setting of some sort. So how can we consider when or when not to bother and make it worth it to use social media in an education setting? Next slide. So we have to take again a look at that definition. Social media has to do with users, the connections they have, and their content that they make. So it's about, we can see when somebody creates social media, who created it. We can take a look at other people and who's following them, or who knows them, or who they know, or what communities they're a part of. And we can also see exactly what they created. For example, if you have a video on YouTube, it's very easy to click and see who created it. You can quickly see who else they're following, and if they belong to a community that's similar to the one you're interested in. And then of course you can see the piece of media that they created. Next slide. So let's take a quick look at these, because this would help us decide. So in social media, we can see the users. Why does that matter? New slide. Well, it allows us to find out the credentials. is this person credible? One of the largest challenges in the future, meaning, are already, is identifying, is content true? Is content true? Does it speak truth, or is it manufactured for a specific reason? For example, there's lots of bots, meaning software online and the internet, that go out, that search the internet, create web pages and post them. Well, that software that does that kind of work, those bots, really does not have the same credibility as a person, and again, I'm using mine, that has a long time of history on the internet of posting technology stuff. So probably a little bit more a credible voice. Also, when we take a look at users, we can see, do they work for a university? Do they work for a marketing company? Are they just a student that is beginning to learn about this topic, and maybe what they're posting is not exactly correct yet? So this concept of users is important. Next slide. Again, the social media, what are their connections? Because that is another way that we can validate their credibility. Next slide. And that here, Twitter is a good example. I use Twitter, for example. I rarely post on Twitter. I used to tried 5-6 years ago to post occasionally in courses. But actually, I use Twitter mainly for following people who use Twitter a lot and share lots of information. So when I do that, when I add a new person to follow, because I get messages daily to my email account, I actually want to know what certain people who are researching in a certain area are talking about. And so really, these connections is really important. Next slide. And then the last part, again, is the user-generated content. Next slide. So what is it that they're posting? One of the things that is the earliest academic presentations I've ever posted was about iPads, about 4 months or 5 months after the iPad was released. I was at a conference and we had been making use of it. So we actually posted a educational video clip of a presentation about using iPads. And so again, by seeing with whom he knows, or the connections, and what the content is, people can then have a very good idea. The person can see if it's credible, reliable, if it's worth it to read these messages for the purpose that somebody has. So, okay, next slide. What does this matter for education? Well, most education that would be technology enabled or technology enhanced are done so for the purpose of two things. In a classroom, when you stand at the front and lecture, really what students and teachers are doing is they're discussing and they're collaborating. So if we're going to use technology, if it doesn't support or enhance discussion or collaborating, then it might not be worth it. Because these are the two real important things to be able to do in a classroom. Now, some would argue, well, if you're in grade 3 and you're learning mathematics, what is the purpose to collaborate? Students don't know anything about mathematics. Perhaps not. But the student and the teacher is not the only person talking to an individual student. They are discussing with their other students beside them and their the people, the other students in that grade 3 classroom. How did you do that? Oh, I got this. Is this correct? So there is discussion going on, even low in smaller grades. Okay, so if we're looking at discussion and collaboration, how can we assess whether that's worth it? Next slide. Well, social media supports this discussion, peer-to-peer active learning. If all the students are sitting there silently listening while a teacher lectures for an hour, probably it's not very good education. Why? Because students can't listen for an hour. There's no interaction. yes, they can sit there and be silent. That doesn't mean they're learning much. So much of our knowledge about education today and in the last 20 years is that students must be active. A teacher speaks maybe for 10 minutes, stop, students do something. So if technology helps that peer-to-peer, to help students to talk, to discuss or collaborate, then it's probably worth it. Next slide. And as we said, the second thing that students do is that they can collaborate. And that's sort of, technology really allows us to collaborate. Again, here's my example of what we're doing today. 15 years ago, this didn't exist. You couldn't share real time, live, like you're listening to me, from most anywhere in the world. You can today. Sometimes, some places it's more expensive, some places it's less. You couldn't share and speak to people around the world at the same time. You might have to make a video and post it and listen to people's, or read people's posts after that. And that wasn't bad, but what we have today in this presentation is really, really immediate collaboration. And why does that matter? Well, that allows us to make the world a very, very small place. I can speak and have many times in the last 5 years spoken to audiences without leaving my office, to anywhere in the world, to many places in the world, discussing the same kinds of problems, so that the last sentence there, we can learn from and with each other. So while it's very nice for me to have my opinion, listening to other people's situations and opinions helps me to solve problems in my world. And one of the most important things I've learned about the MOOC that we've been delivering for 4 years now, because there's many times we hear from people in India, Bangladesh, Africa, Jamaica, the Bahamas, where internet and computer technologies are not as easily accessible as perhaps we have in Canada, is that some solutions for using technology in education can come from these places that really have to be effective at learning to implement technology. Best example in the MOOC that I present, TEL MOOC, which is Technology-Enabled Learning. There was a teacher from Bangladesh that sent me a video showing in a free school in Bangladesh, meaning a free kindergarten to grade 3 school, I believe. The teacher sent a video showing the classroom where students were sitting on the floor with a pencil and paper, all of them learning how to speak proper English and do characters, to write characters in English, not from the teacher, but from a computer laptop that had a CD-ROM with a program on it that showed images, paused, and allowed students to follow and learn English from a computer. One computer, no internet, because it was a CD-ROM program, and 2 little speakers, and 30 students sitting beside each other on the floor drawing. So, you know, the lack of a computer for every student allowed this fantastic situation. In my opinion, it was fantastic because it was effective. And I'd never seen anything like that in our educational situation in North America and more countries that have more access to lots of technology. Every student might have a laptop. Every student might have access to an iPad. And so there's almost nothing they do together. They all sit there on their own. I don't know that that's worth it, because it costs a lot. It costs a lot of money to have so many laptops. I would argue that would be a waste of money. There's too much money spent. The people who are doing really good, the situation about that's doing really good is computer companies are making lots of money selling computers. But is that money that's spent on all of that actually worth it? I don't know. I don't know. Probably in many situations, I would say it's not. So it's our to our benefit to try to figure out and share these kinds of ways in which we can make the cost very effective. And we can, in fact, learn, or I've learned these things and shared them because of that teacher in Bangladesh that sent me an email link to a YouTube video that he had created. So again, next slide. Social media can bring in this real world. And so again, if you would have me present to a classroom somewhere, the real world, I'm an academic, I have some research, I could speak about research. Well, in normal classrooms, the teacher isn't an academic or isn't a researcher, so they're presenting content. So we can actually bring in experts from around the world when we have and make use of some of these technologies. Next slide. So as a summary, where is social media being used in higher education? And that could be in blogs, in like I said, video and YouTube sharing, journals, in wikis, interactive media. There are types of media where we all can be drawing on the screen at the same time. Even in Zoom, well, we can make it so that I could draw on the screen. And of course, social networking sites. So next slide. When we take a look at social media in the classroom, we have to determine whether it's worth the time. Of course, now we're talking about the time of students, because as soon as you use social media, it takes time to sort things out. Again, it has cost. If we have one iPad and 10 students, the cost is much different than if I have 10 iPads and 10 students. And is it actually adding to the curriculum? If nothing that is being taught in the classroom, meaning I'm learning how to add 3 plus 3 or multiply 3 plus 3, is there much benefit to doing social media? Probably not. But if I'm trying to find out situations where, or to trying to find answers and have students do research, well, it probably might be, or it might be. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that's a duplicate slide, so skip one more. So let's now take a look at some examples and talk about if it's worth it. Already, as I mentioned about 5 minutes ago, if we sit there and lecture for an hour, it's probably not good pedagogy. In academia, in university, it's very common for lecturers to speak for an hour, students take notes, then they go off, maybe work with a tutor, and maybe have a chance to ask 1 or 2 questions. And like I said, we can do better than that. And that's really where we're gonna stop. I've already spoken for 25 minutes, which is too long, but we need to get to a certain point so we can learn something as a group. So let's take a look at this as a group now. And so Mustafa, if we actually can open the chat box, perhaps I'm going to click open my chat box, and hopefully people can see where I'm going to go here to everyone.
So yeah, thank you, Dr. Nathaniel. So will you continue, or we will go for the questions?
Yes. So let's consider, I guess, questions. I have 4 of these examples that we can look at over the next 15, 20 minutes. And so this first example is, how can we understand if Twitter in a language learning class, meaning if I'm teaching somebody to speak French language in an English country where English is the first language, I'm teaching French or German, whatever language, the language doesn't matter. Is there a benefit to using Twitter? Remember, I'm in an English situation. How would I consider that? Is it worth the time? So what is the time? What is the time? So I would ask anybody to, I'll pause talking, and to somebody to discuss if they think it's worth the time, cost, and curricular goals for Twitter? And maybe Mustafa, you want to start because other people might be shy or not wanting to. What do you think, Mustafa? Do you think Twitter in a language learning class has benefit? Sorry, we can't hear you. Microphone.
Yeah, okay, fine. So I think for language learning, it is very important to communicate each other, to collaborate, especially if they cannot communicate. Then, so Twitter can be, yeah, for example, for uh, writing skills or communication skills is important. So it depends on the context, actually, in what context we are using Twitter and in what type of content we are sharing and what kind of communication we are making. So definitely for language learning, communication is one of the means.
And do you think it'd be worth the time in a lecture classroom in your university? Or
Yeah, I
worth
think,
it?
yeah, it's important. But, sometimes, for example, in my class, for any other, it's not a language course, but I use for example, if I want the feedback from the students and if I want them to communicate each other. So sometimes I use, for example, WhatsApp. Sometimes I use Padlet, so that everybody's comments are coming or feedbacks are coming together. It creates a cloud, then they can be engaged in a discussion. So Twitter can be used in that way. We can use hashtag, or we use some other forms to engage the learners within the class. Yeah, that is possible.
And you bring up an excellent point, and which has been around probably for as long as I can remember. The early uses of the internet or these cloud discussion things were in fact, like you mentioned, if we all used the same Twitter hashtag, we could all have a continuous discussion. And that's really the places I've seen that work really good is at conferences. Have you not been to conferences where they're using Twitter hashtag to share what's going on in the sessions?
Yeah. So it was very much interesting. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So I
always
mean,
we use the
you
hashtag, and our pictures, everything were just projected on the screens. So it was interesting.
yes, yeah, I've
And
seen
at the
that
end
many
of
times.
every
Yeah,
day, at the end of the session, so we found that our pictures are there and everything is there.
yep, exactly. So I mean, Twitter or I guess again you mentioned WhatsApp. WhatsApp is sort of more one-to-one, but or tends to be more one-to-one. But of course, I've heard of students teachers using a WhatsApp group to have conversations after the class is finished about the topic, correct?
Yeah. WhatsApp group is very important because through WhatsApp, what I usually do that if the students, for example, if they try to share some images or some of their works, for example, if I have 40 students, so if they get some activity, so if they do it, and they can just take the picture and they can put it into WhatsApp, so I can transfer it on the screen and I can see it together. So it actually depends. If the students are not used to Twitter, the teachers are not used to Twitter, so in that case, whatever technology they are being used to, that is better to use. So that's why in Bangladesh and India, most of the people are there, they are comfortable with WhatsApp. So that's why I use WhatsApp. But Twitter is a very interesting tool. So if we use hashtag, so it can create a thread also. So it is very interesting also.
And I think you've spoken exactly to the point. You mentioned you trying to use technology students are familiar with. There's not much benefit to sit for an hour to show students how to use Twitter if in fact they all use with WhatsApp. Just use WhatsApp. So yeah, that's really good. And thanks for that example there. I know I'm gonna just open that link and take a look quick. Pop quiz. A pop quiz. That's excellent. So learning English and education. So somebody has an example for us Thank you very much. And yeah, so you can click on the quiz and provide an answer. And I presume this is for a group. I don't know because I'm not sure of the example, but hashtag is ESL. Well, thank you, Dr. Conero. That's an excellent example of in fact, how you can do it. And I've never heard of that, by the way. I've never heard of using a quiz on Twitter till just now. So again, my point about having us being able to collaborate around the world is probably one of the most important things with this, with technology, because not only are you learning something, so am I as the presenter. And I have never heard of anybody doing quizzes on Twitter till just now. And I'm not really interested or follow Twitter research much, but a little bit. I do follow it a little bit, and I find and watch for where it's used. So I will certainly check out that that link a bit more. And what an excellent use! What an excellent use! So thanks, Mustafa, and might be a poll. Okay, so right, so you could do a real-time poll, and I'm sure that I know there are other technologies where you can put up polls and share the link, the URL to your classroom, even draw it up on the board, and students can go to it and answer a poll. There are lots of technologies that allow students, for example, if in a lecture theater, there's 300 students, how could I possibly know? I don't have time to ask them all, do you know what this chemical is? You could have a poll, and they can either raise their hand and go yes or no, and very quickly we could find uses for that kind of thing. So this concept, Twitter, actually, the whole idea behind Twitter is small sentence in communication, not long sentence, small bit, tiny bit, micro blog. So not a whole page, takes too long to read. These little bits can really help us in classrooms. Thank you very much for that. Next slide. So let's take a look. If internet searching in a biology class. So now let's say I have 30 students or 40 students in a biology class. And we're learning high school biology or university biology. Is it worth it for the teacher, who's likely in a microbiology or some sort of biology laboratory setting, or even in a lecture theater where they're speaking about biology, is there benefit to make sure that we have access to the internet while the class is going on? That question is it worth the time? So I have lots of content that my students, I've taught biology and high school sciences. Is it worth the time really to stop my lecture where they really need the information? It's very specific terminology. Is there any benefit to internet searching? Is it worth the cost of the time that we stop and use the internet? Does it meet curriculum? Would one of you like to take the mic and speak about an example of how you think it might or might not be valuable?
If anyone from the participants, if you like to ask any question, you can just turn on your mic and you can ask the question. So in between, because our time is almost, we are at the end. So we'll have another 18 minutes time. This is total 1 hour. So I think Dr. Nathaniel will just finish the slides in a few minutes, then you will open the floor. But within the during the presentation, you can ask the question at this stage.
Yes, that's great, Mustafa. Then, if anybody would like to answer or ask questions, but I'm fine. I can walk through this example if somebody doesn't want to. But I do know that. Okay. Here we go. Here's an example. Now some Bangladeshi school use NetGen, Meebopath software in class, but this is only teacher users friendly, not all students friendly. how to improve the software, and our most problem is low internet. And in fact, I had already mentioned earlier this concept of using CD-ROMs, because one of the larger problems in many countries is the lack of any good internet. And even when there's internet, sometimes lack of power. So if everybody has their devices on, it's difficult for power. So how can we, how can we examine it? If you've got low internet speeds, it probably is not worth the time. If I have to type in a term and wait for 2 minutes, but my class is only 30 minutes or only 1 hour, it's probably not worth the time. But if your assignment is to explore terminology that is specific, I know from probably 15 years ago that on the internet there are many universities that specialize in certain biology research that have spent a lot of money making very elaborate and sophisticated animations. And I often would send my students to several websites where there were animations. For example, in biology, we teach about mitosis and meiosis in cells, and replication and cell growth. I can talk about that and show pictures all day. But if I send my students to see a 1 minute animation, the understanding about those processes is much better than my talking about it. So in that case, I might send students to do it. Or, as we just have this example, maybe the teacher would take questions from the students and do the search in front of them all. Is it worth the time there? Perhaps. Is it worth the cost? Well, the teacher is the only one doing it. It's only the screen that they're teaching with from any rate. And does it meet the curricular goals? Well, you're leading this discussion. So in some senses, perhaps an internet search might enhance a lecture. It's doing something that the lecturer cannot do easily. And again, why would I deal with that? If we had a classroom with 300 students and they're all using the Wi-Fi, 300 students accessing the Wi-Fi is going to slow it down to almost nothing. But one teacher doing it, it goes fine. So there's an example of how we might think about and walk through deciding whether it's worth the time. How would I say that it's worth the cost? And does it actually help for my curriculum? Would anybody else like to add to this in the chat or a question on this before we move to the next example? I have 2 more examples here that we can look at, and we'll have just about the right amount of time. Anybody else on this one? Thank you for posting that example there. Okay, well, let's look at the next one then. A tablet. Sorry, next slide, Mustafa. A tablet in physical education class. So I'm going to pause for 1 full minute. I will not speak for a minute. And I want you to think about using an iPad or an Android tablet in a phys ed class where we're learning maybe about soccer or football or badminton or athletics. So let's think about that. Is it worth the time, cost, and goals? And I'm just going to pause for a second. And so part of the thing that's difficult in some technology teaching or using, for example, like this, is we don't often stop long enough for people to think. So like I said, I'm going to stop. I'm going to put my mic on mute for 30 seconds, and then we'll come back and see. Okay, so who would like to take the microphone or type? Is it worth it? And if nobody is going to do it, then it has to be Mustafa. You want to give a chat about it? Mustafa, what do you think?
Very difficult question. So, tablet in physical education class. Yeah, I don't know. It depends on the content, what content we are trying to use on tablet. So, for
Okay,
example,
well, this is exactly what I wanted to demonstrate. You and I discussing this, and everybody else listening, we might peak or start some ideas for people. So when I take a look at a situation like this, a technology in a classroom, I first start with the technology. So, and I'd like to continue to ask you some questions. What can a tablet do? What kinds of things can a tablet do?
yeah, yes, through the tablet we can actually watch the videos, and
Yep,
we can
yep,
read something on it. We can
yep,
respond to if it is connected to internet and there's some
yep.
social media
Most
platforms. We can,
tablets have video cameras today, yeah,
yeah,
or cameras.
yeah,
Yep. So with this kind of thing, you can do images. You said access. So, example, if I'm teaching about some athletics, for example, to run the 100 meters, to be able to access the internet and watch some of the best people in the world come out of the blocks, meaning start the race, might be very valuable if my students are learning that. If it's about soccer and we can access some video that shows how to properly kick a ball, or other professionals, there might be an example. Another one where I've actually seen tablets in physical education is to video somebody doing a skill and then taking the tablet and showing them what they just did. Because in physical education, it's not easy for the person to do and see themselves. So this quick access to video, for example, would be very valuable. So you are right about this. It depends on what's the curriculum, but if it's to learn and refine a physical thing, skill that somebody's trying to accomplish, videoing it, and then perhaps many people videoing it and then comparing the videos, taking a look at them together or sharing them with the class. So at the same time, if we sit there and use tablets for the week doing all this comparing and never actually do any physical skill, then it's probably not worth it. If it's, I don't have any access to tablets, can I perhaps use a smartphone? Is it worth it for me to practice at home and send a video, or have my friend video me and send that to an account, Twitter account hashtag, so that everybody can see what, we can share what we're doing? Good questions. In all situations, it is certainly the teacher has to decide if in fact it's worth it. The reason I brought this one up is I used tablets 10 years ago, meaning 4 months after the iPad was released. I used that tablet in physical education, in a dance unit in a physical education class. And why is because I didn't have time as a teacher to talk to 30 students, but I had 6 or 7 tablets with a whole bunch of videos downloaded to them. And I shared the tablets with the students. They went off and they practiced in a group, 2 or 3 students, using the tablet as the teacher. They watched the videos that I had recorded. I made the videos of me doing the skill or somebody, and then I gave it to them, and as a group, they worked through it. But it took a lot of time to set that up. And of course, I had to have 4 or 5 iPads. So not a common use, but for me in that situation, it was very useful because I could only work with 1 or 2 students at a time, and yet there's 30. So what will the rest do? Stand there and look? It's much better if they're off trying, because that's part of physical education. Does that make sense to you, Mustafa?
Yes, yeah, I think yeah, it is interesting because yeah, sometimes, for example, I have a group who together we in the morning we exercise. So when I go outside, so I recorded the whole exercise event and I use that for my own exercise. So it is really interesting because I cannot remember the sequence, gestures, etc. So it really helps when I
Yes,
record something. Yeah.
you bring a perfect point up. Trying to remember a half-hour sequence, it's much better for us to watch and follow along and work and be thinking about doing the physical activity precisely with power, with whatever elements of the physical activity is, rather than trying to think ahead. And so you're very right. There has been much sharing of videos and DVDs and now the internet for exercise programs. So yeah, you got a perfect example. How about if you're teaching something that you're not an expert in? You're not an expert in a certain kind of dance, but you want your students to see it or try it. Well, it's better to watch it somebody who's an expert or professional. So yeah,
Uh,
that's an excellent example of this
okay.
exercise.
Dr. Nathaniel, is there any, I think another 2 slides. So
One.
we like to open the session to the participants. So for open question, if they have to you,
Sure.
because maybe they are
Oh yeah.
curious.
Yeah,
So
and I can
could
stay
you,
a couple minutes longer. That's not a problem. But yeah,
okay,
if there's
because
general questions, we can do that. I sort
okay,
of use
so
this area as part of those general questions because often a lot of people aren't sure, what they can ask. But yeah, perhaps let's
okay,
pause.
so better we finish the slides, then
Yeah,
we'll just open the, yeah, so we'll stop
sure.
sharing, then answer the
Yeah,
question.
the last slide. Go ahead. And again, if we think about a laptop in music class, and I'll share one example. My daughter was taking a high level of piano, and in my community, there was nobody that was a grade 10 music teacher to teach piano. So the way that my daughter accessed this was to use a laptop and Skype the teacher from a long way away to use her to teach her piano because nobody in our community had that level of piano. She was already conservatory level, where she was quite good at it. So she didn't have any way to access an expert to teach her anymore. So there's an example of a laptop in a music class. So that's my last example for us to discuss. Thank you very much. I hope it's been more interactive than just listening to me talk for half an hour. And next slide is my last one.